Another major economic difference between the article system and the Constitution, it involves the ability of the national government to implement any kind of like taxes. Under the article system, the national government did not possess the ability to tax. Only the states could directly tax their citizens, but the national government could not. The national government couldn't even force the states to contribute money. They could ask the states to contribute money to the national treasury, but if the states didn't want to contribute the money, they didn't have to. There was no way for the national government to force them. And you may say, hey, great, no taxes. But clearly, taxes are a necessary evil. They pay for lots of things that are needed. And if you create a system of government, a national government that can't tax, you're basically creating a system of government that's going to go broke because it has no way to fund itself. So clearly, this is one of the major changes that had to occur with the Constitution, was the ability of the national government to gain the right to tax. And the national government does gain the ability under the new Constitution to force the states to contribute money to the national treasury, even if they don't want to. And this greatly helps the stable like revenue of like the United States. It's not until 1913 when the 17th Amendment passed to the Constitution that the national government can take income like right from the citizens and bypass the states completely. Obviously, the income tax, which is in place today, hasn't always been in place. And when that went into effect in 1913, it gave the national government a lot more power to raise revenue once they go right at the citizens' like incomes. It's also important to note that there's another compromise sort of involved in the discussion of taxation when they talk about the Constitutional Convention. It was decided that the population of a state would determine two things. What we just talked about, how much in taxes or how much money the states would have to contribute to the national treasury is one thing that would be determined by population. The bigger states would have to kick in more money. It's only fair. And the other thing is what we previously talked about, which is representation in Congress. The House of Representatives, the number of representatives you would have in the House would be determined by your population. So the bigger states would have more reps. What the northern and southern states couldn't agree on at the Constitutional Convention was whether or not slaves should count as a part of a state's population. Clearly, the North didn't have slaves at this point, but the South had a sizable slave population. So the North wanted to count the slaves for taxation purposes because it meant the Southerners would have to pay more taxes, but didn't want to count them for representation purposes because obviously they didn't have any slaves to count, and that would give the South more representatives in the House of Reps. Vice versa, the South wanted opposite. They didn't want to count slaves for taxation purposes because that would hurt them, but they did want to count slaves for representation purposes. And they couldn't really agree on how to handle this. So it was decided that the three-fifths compromise would be adopted, and that's that you would basically count three-fifths of your slave population for both taxation and representation purposes. Clearly, there's a horrendous social message that is sent as a result of this, that African Americans are not worth whole people, that essentially they're worth three-fifths of a white person. But it does establish a compromise that works out both representation and taxation issues. So three-fifths of the slave population in the southern states would be counted for both taxation and representation purposes.